The first German soldiers who faced the British in the Second World War did not always see them as terrifying. Some saw them as stubborn. Some saw them as brave, but badly used. Some thought the British Army was too slow, too cautious, too tied to old habits from another age. And then, again and again, those same German soldiers discovered something that did not fit neatly into their reports. British soldiers did not break easily. They could be pushed back, surrounded, bombed, exhausted, short of sleep, short of food, and sometimes badly led. They could lose ground, they could lose equipment, they could suffer disasters that would have destroyed the confidence of another army. But they had a habit the German command found deeply uncomfortable. They came back. In France, they came back from the beaches of Dunkirk. In the desert, they came back after defeats that seemed final. In the skies, British pilots kept climbing into aircraft when the future of Britain seemed to hang by a thread. At sea, British sailors kept the routes open through storms, submarines, mines, and fire. And in Normandy, when German officers expected to face a soft army that would crack under pressure, they met men who advanced through hedgerows, shellfire, mud, and fear with a grim steadiness that was not theatrical, but relentless. This is not a story about a cartoon enemy secretly trembling before Britain from the first day of the war. That would be too easy. The truth is more interesting. German opinion of British soldiers changed over time. It was shaped by propaganda, by old stereotypes, by battlefield reports, by defeats, by prisoners, by interrogations, and by the hard experience of facing British troops at close range. The German army of the Second World War was experienced, disciplined, and dangerous. It had crushed Poland, broken through France, driven armies into retreat, and shocked the world with the speed of its operations. When German officers judged an enemy, their judgment mattered because they had seen war at its most brutal. So when British soldiers earned respect from such an opponent, it was not handed out cheaply. It was paid for. Before this story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps keep serious British history alive, especially the stories of soldiers, sailors, pilots, commanders, codebreakers, medics, engineers, and civilians who carried Britain through the darkest years of the 20th century. To understand what Germans really thought about British soldiers, it is necessary to begin with the uncomfortable part. At the start of the war, many German officers did not believe the British Army was the greatest immediate threat on land. Britain was respected as a naval power. Britain was respected as an empire. Britain was respected for money, industry, intelligence, diplomacy, and the ability to build coalitions. But the British Army itself was often viewed through older German assumptions. Britain was seen as a maritime power first, not a continental military machine. The Royal Navy was the shield. The Royal Air Force was becoming the sword in the sky. But the army, in German eyes, was smaller, less modern, and less prepared for the kind of fast war Germany intended to fight. There was some truth in this, but not the whole truth. The British Army in the late 1930s was not designed to match the German Army division for division on the European continent. Britain had global commitments. Its forces had been spread across an empire. Its officers had experience in many kinds of service, but not always in the modern armored warfare that Germany had spent years developing. German doctrine valued speed, initiative, combined arms, and the sudden collapse of enemy command. The aim was not simply to defeat a line, it was to shatter the enemy's ability to understand what was happening. In the spring of 1940, that method struck with devastating force. The German offensive through the Low Countries and France moved with a violence and speed that stunned Europe. The British Expeditionary Force, fighting alongside French and Belgian forces, was forced back towards the Channel. German armoured spearheads cut through the Allied position, roads filled with refugees. Units lost contact, orders became confused. The old map of Western Europe seemed to be tearing apart by the hour. To German soldiers, the British retreat may have looked like proof of their assumptions. The British had come to the continent, now they were trapped by the sea. But even here, the German picture was not simple. The British Expeditionary Force suffered badly. Men were killed, wounded, captured, scattered. Much of the army's equipment had to be abandoned. Guns, vehicles, supplies, ammunition, radios, and heavy weapons were left behind in France. Britain saved the men at Dunkirk, but it did not save the army intact. It was a terrible military defeat. And yet, inside that defeat, German commanders saw something they could not ignore. British units fought rearguard actions. They bought time. They held roads, villages, canals, and approaches while the evacuation gathered pace. They were tired and often outmaneuvered, but many still obeyed orders under conditions that seemed hopeless. The defense of places such as Calais became part of the larger story. Whether later claims about its exact effect on Dunkirk were sometimes overstated is still debated by historians, but the essential fact remains. British soldiers stood and fought while other men were trying to escape. At Dunkirk, the German army had the British trapped against the sea. The story should have ended there. Instead, more than 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated, including a large corps of the British Army. The men came home without their equipment, but they came home. From the German perspective, this mattered. A defeated army that survives is not the same as an army destroyed. The British had lost a campaign. They had not lost the war. That distinction would haunt Germany. German propaganda tried to present Dunkirk as humiliation. In military terms, it was indeed a disaster. But propaganda could not erase the strategic reality. The British Army had escaped annihilation. Britain remained in the war. The island had not asked for terms. The British government did not collapse. The Royal Navy still controlled the waters around Britain. The Royal Air Force still waited in the sky. And British soldiers, instead of disappearing from history, began rebuilding. This was the first thing Germans truly learned about them. British defeat did not automatically produce British surrender. That was dangerous. In the summer of 1940, the main German view of Britain was no longer simply about soldiers on land. It was about whether Britain itself could be broken. The Battle of Britain became the test. German air power was thrown against British airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, ports, and cities. The plan was to weaken Britain enough for invasion or force it towards submission. Here, German pilots were not facing infantrymen in mud or desert. They were facing fighter command, radar, ground crews, anti-aircraft defenses, and a national system that turned the whole island into a battlefield. German airmen discovered that British resistance was not only emotional, it was organized. Britain's air defense system was one of the most important achievements of the war. Pilots mattered, and they mattered enormously. But so did the people who repaired runways, tracked raids, filtered information, directed squadrons, refueled aircraft, and returned damaged machines to the fight. German pilots could respect courage in the air. They could also see that Britain had built a defensive machine of discipline and intelligence. The Royal Air Force was not simply throwing brave young men into the sky, it was fighting with a system. That system helped Britain survive. For German commanders, survival was not supposed to be enough. Britain's refusal to break meant Germany could not safely turn the war into a clean continental victory. Britain remained a base, a symbol, a problem, and eventually a launch point for liberation. But the German soldiers' opinion of the British Army was still not fixed. In the desert, it would change again. North Africa became one of the most important testing grounds for British and Commonwealth forces. The fighting was harsh, exposed, and psychologically exhausting. The desert was not empty romance. It was heat, dust, thirst, flies, broken engines, long supply lines, sudden attacks, and distances that swallowed men whole. At first, British and Commonwealth forces won impressive victories against Italian forces. But the arrival of German forces under Erwin Rommel changed the campaign dramatically. The German Afrika Korps was aggressive, well-led, and tactically dangerous. Rommel's operations repeatedly placed British commanders under severe pressure. The British learned, often painfully, that the German army in the desert was not simply brave. It was fast, flexible, and skilled at using confusion as a weapon. German officers, in turn, often saw British forces as courageous but uneven. They noticed British discipline. They noticed the ability of British and Commonwealth troops to endure bombardment and hardship. But they also criticized British tactical handling, especially in the early years of the Desert War. They believed British attacks could be rigid. They believed British command sometimes moved slowly. They believed British armor was sometimes used in ways that allowed German anti-tank guns to do terrible damage. Some of those criticisms were not imaginary. Britain did make mistakes in the desert. Command changes, poor coordination, equipment problems, and tactical failures cost lives. British soldiers paid for errors made above them. Tank crews burned in machines that had been sent forward without proper support. Infantrymen held positions while the battlefield shifted around them. Gunners fought until ammunition ran low. Medical units tried to keep men alive in conditions that offered no mercy. Patriotism does not require pretending every decision was perfect. It requires remembering who carried the cost. The Germans could criticize British methods and still respect British endurance. In fact, that contradiction is one of the keys to the whole story. German soldiers often thought the British Army was not as tactically fluid as the German Army. But they also learned that British troops could absorb punishment and remain in the field. That kind of enemy is difficult to defeat. A flashy army may collapse when its plan fails. A stubborn army becomes more dangerous the longer it survives. By the time of El Alamein, the British Eighth Army had changed. It had been reinforced, reorganized, and supplied. It had learned hard lessons. It had also gained a commander, Bernard Montgomery, whose reputation remains debated, but whose effect on morale and preparation in that moment was real. Montgomery did not turn British soldiers into different men overnight. He gave them a clearer structure, a stronger sense of confidence, and a plan that matched British strengths. Artillery, logistics, preparation, infantry determination, armor in mass, and relentless pressure. The German and Italian forces facing them were not weak. They were experienced and dangerous. But they were also stretched by supply problems, distance, fuel shortages, and Allied pressure across the Mediterranean. At El Alamein, British and Commonwealth troops fought through minefields, artillery fire, anti-tank guns, and counterattacks. This was not a clean charge into glory. It was grinding, frightening work. Engineers opened paths through danger. Infantry moved forward in darkness. Tank crews waited for the moment when waiting itself became unbearable. Gunners fired until the desert shook. The victory did not come because the enemy was foolish. It came because British power had become organized enough to turn endurance into momentum. For German observers, this was a serious warning. The British Army could learn. That may have been more worrying than any single act of bravery. A soldier can be brave once. An army that learns from defeat becomes a long-term threat. In North Africa, German respect for British soldiers grew not from sentiment, but from experience. British forces had been beaten, pushed back, criticized, mocked by some, and underestimated by others. Then they adapted. Then they advanced. Then the Axis position in North Africa collapsed. The first major Allied victory of the Second World War did not belong to one man or one unit. It belonged to a vast effort. British, Commonwealth, Imperial, and Allied. Men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and other parts of the wider war effort fought in conditions that tested every part of the human body and mind. German soldiers could see the difference. The British were no longer simply the army that had escaped from Dunkirk. They were becoming the army that returned with weight behind it. But what did ordinary German soldiers really think? This is where the story becomes more complicated. After the war, historians studied captured documents, interrogations, memoirs, diaries, and secretly recorded conversations among German prisoners. These sources do not all say the same thing. That is exactly why they are valuable. Some German soldiers were arrogant. Some were frightened. Some respected British artillery and air power more than British infantry. Some thought British soldiers were brave, but predictable. Some thought the British were too cautious. Some were shocked by the scale of British resources. Some admired British calm. Some hated Britain because Nazi propaganda had taught them to. Some separated British soldiers from British leaders. Some simply wanted the war to end. There was no single German mind. There were millions of German men in uniform, shaped by class, age, ideology, battlefield experience, propaganda, fear, ambition, and survival. But patterns do appear. German soldiers often respected enemies who stayed steady under fire. British soldiers earned that respect again and again. They were not always described as brilliant improvisers. They were often described, in effect, as disciplined, tough, and hard to shift. The British soldier's strength was not always speed. It was staying power. That was a very British kind of danger, not loud, not theatrical, but difficult to remove. The same pattern appeared at sea. For German naval commanders and submarine crews, Britain was not mainly an army. Britain was a maritime civilization armed for war. The Royal Navy was not merely a fighting service. It was the old shield of the island, the force that kept Britain alive through blockade, convoy, and global supply. German submarine crews understood the importance of the Atlantic. If Britain could be starved of food, fuel, weapons, and supplies, then soldiers on land would not matter. Factories would slow. Aircraft production would suffer. Civilians would weaken. Britain's ability to continue the war would be strangled. The Battle of the Atlantic was therefore not a side campaign. It was a struggle for Britain's heartbeat. German submarine crews were dangerous, skilled, and often brave in their own right. They fought in cramped steel vessels under appalling pressure, facing depth charges, aircraft, escorts, and the constant possibility of dying unseen beneath black water. But British and Allied convoy escorts kept coming. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates, aircraft, merchant sailors, code breakers, shipyard workers, radar specialists, and escort commanders turned the Atlantic into a battlefield of patience and terror. A British sailor might never see the enemy who was trying to kill him. He might only hear the alarm, feel the ship turn, watch the sea explode, and then wait. The German view of British sea power was shaped by centuries of history, but in the Second World War it became immediate. Britain's ability to hold the sea lanes was not a romantic memory. It was a living military fact. If German commanders thought British soldiers on land could sometimes be slow, they did not think Britain at sea was weak. The sea was Britain's oldest weapon, and Germany never fully broke it. We've reached halfway, and if you are still watching, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you think was the most underestimated British strength in the Second World War. The Army, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, intelligence, industry, or civilian endurance. The German view changed again in 1944. By then, Britain was no longer standing alone. The United States was fully in the war. The Soviet Union was destroying German power in the East at a scale almost beyond imagination. Allied industry was producing ships, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and vehicles in enormous quantities. The war had become a contest of systems, not only soldiers. But Normandy still had to be taken by men. On the 6th of June, 1944, British, Canadian, American, and other Allied troops crossed the Channel in the largest amphibious operation in history. British forces landed at Gold and Sword beaches. Canadian forces landed at Juno. American forces landed at Utah and Omaha. Behind the landings stood years of planning, deception, naval power, air power, engineering, logistics, and intelligence. The Germans had been deceived about the exact location and timing of the invasion. British intelligence played a central part in that deception. Double agents, false signals, invented formations, and carefully controlled information helped convince German command that the main blow might still fall elsewhere. This mattered, because German respect for British military ability was not only about infantry courage, it was also about cunning. Britain had a talent for making war with the mind before making war with the gun. At Bletchley Park, in intelligence offices, in naval plotting rooms, in deception planning, and in the work of people whose names were unknown to the public, Britain fought a hidden war of information. The German command did not always understand how deeply it had been penetrated, misled, and read. That is one of the quietest forms of victory, when the enemy does not even know the shape of the weapon being used against him. But once the troops were ashore in Normandy, deception alone could not win. The fighting became brutal. The German army in Normandy was not a broken force. It contained experienced officers, hardened soldiers, powerful defensive positions, and armored forwards that could inflict terrible losses. The terrain was difficult. Villages, hedgerows, orchards, fields, and narrow roads created a battlefield where every advance could become a killing ground. British troops faced an enemy that knew how to defend. German soldiers understood concealment, counterattack, artillery coordination, and the use of anti-tank weapons. They were dangerous even when outnumbered. They had fought for years. Many had survived the Eastern Front, North Africa, Italy, or earlier campaigns in the West. This makes the British achievement in Normandy more impressive, not less. The British Army in Normandy has sometimes been criticized as slow. Some observers, then and later, thought British progress lacked the dash of earlier German operations. But this criticism can miss the reality of what the British were doing. British forces were holding and wearing down a large part of German strength, including armoured formations, while the wider Allied campaign developed. The battle was not simply a race across a map. It was an industrial, tactical, and human struggle to break German power in France. British soldiers advanced under artillery fire. They fought through villages that could kill a platoon in minutes. They operated with tanks that were vulnerable to German anti-tank guns. They endured mortars, snipers, machine guns, mines, and the awful uncertainty of not knowing whether the next hedge concealed death. German officers could mock British caution, But caution in Normandy was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was memory. The British Army had not forgotten the cost of the First World War. It had not forgotten what happened when men were thrown forward without enough preparation. British commanders often preferred firepower to unnecessary infantry sacrifice. That approach could be slow, it could be frustrating, it could be imperfect, but it also reflected a grim lesson learned from earlier bloodshed. The British did not always fight the war Germany wanted them to fight. Germany had built its legend on movement, shock, speed, and command initiative. Britain increasingly fought with artillery, logistics, air support, intelligence, engineering, and coordination. To a German officer trained to admire maneuver, this could look uninspired. To a British infantryman alive at the end of the day because the guns had done their work, it looked rather different. This is one of the great misunderstandings in how armies judge each other. One army may admire brilliance, another may value survival. The British way of war in the later stages of the conflict was not always elegant, but it was increasingly effective. It used the strengths Britain and its allies possessed: ships, aircraft, guns, supplies, planning, intelligence, and an ability to keep pressure on the enemy until his options narrowed. German soldiers in Normandy experienced this pressure physically. They faced constant air attack when movement became visible. They faced artillery that could arrive with terrifying speed. They faced infantry that might not move fast, but often came on behind a wall of fire. They faced tanks, engineers, and supply lines that kept feeding the battle. This changed respect into something colder. The British soldier was not necessarily feared because he was imagined as superhuman. He was feared because he represented a system that did not stop. Behind him stood the guns. Behind the guns stood the ships. Behind the ships stood the factories. Behind the factories stood an island that had refused to leave the war when leaving would have been easier. That is what Germany had failed to solve. In the East, German soldiers often described the Soviet war as vast, savage, and existential. In the West, they often saw the British and Americans through different categories: material power, air superiority, artillery, supply, and methodical advance. But the danger was no less real. A German unit under British fire in Normandy did not experience theory. It experienced concussion, smoke, fear, orders shouted over explosions, and the steady collapse of position after position. British courage in Normandy was not always the courage of a bayonet charge. Sometimes it was the courage of going forward slowly, because everyone knew the next field had already killed men. Sometimes it was a tank crew climbing into a vehicle after seeing what happened to the last one. Sometimes it was a stretcher bearer walking into fire without carrying a weapon. Sometimes it was a young officer trying to sound calm because his men were listening. Sometimes it was a sergeant taking over because the officer was dead. Sometimes it was a soldier who did not feel brave at all, but kept moving because stopping would betray the man beside him. German soldiers understood that kind of courage because they had seen it in many armies. They respected it when it stood in front of them. The British reputation also changed through prisoners. Captured British soldiers often made an impression not because they boasted, but because they remained controlled. German guards and interrogators did not always encounter broken men. They encountered men who were exhausted, hungry, wounded, angry, frightened, and still capable of a dry answer, a steady look, or a refusal to give more than required. That kind of composure has deep roots in British military culture. It can be exaggerated into myth, but it was real enough to be noticed. The British soldier was not emotionless. That is nonsense. Men were afraid. Men cried. Men shook. Men wrote letters home with hands that had seen terrible things. Men carried memories they could not explain when the war ended. But British military culture often taught men to master the outward display of fear, not to feel nothing, but to continue functioning. That mattered. The Germans also noticed British class differences, regimental traditions, accents, and the strange mixture of formality and informality inside British units. The British Army could seem old-fashioned from the outside, with its rituals, mess culture, regimental pride, and inherited language. But under pressure, those traditions could give men a sense of belonging that was stronger than abstract slogans. A man did not only fight for strategy, he fought because his mates were there. He fought because the regiment had a name. He fought because the dead were watching in memory. He fought because he had been told to hold and did not want to be the one who failed. German soldiers understood unit pride. They had their own forms of it. That is one reason they could recognize it in British troops, even when they disliked them. But the German view of British soldiers was never only admiration. There was anger, too. German propaganda had spent years portraying Britain as hypocritical, imperial, decadent, and manipulative. Nazi ideology blamed Britain for encirclement, for continuing the war, and for denying Germany the victory Hitler believed it deserved. Many German soldiers absorbed parts of this worldview. Others repeated it without deep thought. Some believed they were fighting a British Empire that used other nations to bleed Germany while Britain stayed protected by the sea. This idea had older roots. Britain had often fought continental wars by coalition, finance, blockade, and sea power. To German nationalists, this could look like Britain making others fight while it controlled the balance from offshore. But the Second World War exposed the weakness of that accusation. British soldiers did fight. British sailors did die. British pilots did burn in the sky. British civilians were bombed in their streets. British commandos landed on hostile coasts. British prisoners endured captivity. British and Commonwealth troops fought in the desert, in Italy, in Burma, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and across the seas. The war was not fought by Britain alone, and it must never be remembered as if it was. Men from across the Empire and Commonwealth were essential to the wider British war effort. Indian, African, Caribbean, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and other forces served in campaigns that shaped the outcome of the war. Their identities should not be erased. Their service was not decorative, it was central. German soldiers facing British command often faced this wider world. That was another reason Britain was so difficult to defeat. Britain was an island, but the British war effort was global. In Burma and the Far East, British and Commonwealth troops faced the Imperial Japanese military system in some of the harshest conditions of the war. German soldiers did not experience that front directly, but German observers understood that Britain was fighting a worldwide conflict. The British Army was not only dealing with Germany, it was stretched across theatres, climates, enemies, and crises. This sometimes weakened Britain. It also revealed the scale of British endurance. A nation fighting everywhere can appear overstretched. It can also become impossible to finish off. By the final year of the war, German attitudes had darkened. The confidence of 1940 was gone. German cities were bombed. German armies were retreating. The Eastern Front was collapsing into catastrophe. The Western Allies had crossed into Germany. The Nazi regime demanded continued resistance, even when defeat was obvious. By then, British soldiers were no longer viewed as a minor land force. They were part of the army of invasion. They arrived with armor, artillery, engineers, aircraft, medical units, supply columns, and the quiet professionalism of men who had been at war for years. Many had started the war as civilians. By 1945, they were veterans. German civilians and soldiers encountered British troops not as an abstract stereotype, but as armed men entering towns, taking prisoners, occupying territory, and uncovering the consequences of Nazi rule. The liberation of concentration camps revealed horrors that words can barely hold. British soldiers who entered places such as Bergen-Belsen saw human suffering on a scale that marked them for life. This was not a battlefield victory in the ordinary sense. It was a confrontation with the moral reality of the regime Britain had fought. Any honest discussion of German views must end here, with the collapse of illusion. Nazi Germany had claimed to be building a new order. British soldiers helped expose what that order truly meant. And yet, the British response after victory was not simply revenge. There was justice, occupation, rebuilding, and the difficult beginning of reconciliation. The same British society that had endured bombing and loss would later take part in reconstructing a Europe where Germany could become something other than the state that had followed Hitler into ruin. That, too, is part of the legacy. So what did Germans really think about British soldiers in the Second World War? They thought many things. At first, some underestimated them. Some saw them as brave but poorly prepared. Some considered the British Army less tactically impressive than the German Army. Some respected British discipline while criticising British methods. Some feared British sea power more than British infantry. Some feared British air power, artillery, intelligence, and resources. Some learned in the desert that British forces could recover from defeat. Some learned in Normandy that British troops could fight a brutal battle of attrition and still advance. Some learned too late that Britain's greatest strength was not one soldier, one general, one weapon, or one speech. It was the ability to endure long enough for every part of the national war effort to begin working together. Army, Navy, Air Force, industry, intelligence, empire and commonwealth, civilian stamina, memory, discipline. The German army often admired speed. Britain survived by depth. Depth of sea power, depth of institutions, depth of alliances, depth of industrial effort, depth of historical patience, depth of ordinary courage. The British soldier was not always the fastest man on the battlefield. He was not always the best equipped in the early years. He was not always perfectly led. He was not invincible. That is what makes the story worth telling. Invincible men do not need courage. Human men do. The British soldiers of the Second World War were human. They were frightened, tired, imperfect, funny, stubborn, angry, homesick, and sometimes very young. Many wanted nothing more heroic than to survive and go home. But when history placed them under the weight of the century, they carried more than anyone had a right to ask. And the enemy noticed. Not always with admiration, sometimes with irritation, sometimes with contempt that slowly turned into caution, sometimes with respect that came too late. The British did not win because Germans secretly thought they were unbeatable. They won because, in battle after battle, enough British soldiers refused to behave like a beaten army. Dunkirk did not end them. The Blitz did not break the island behind them. The desert did not finish them. The Atlantic did not starve them. Normandy did not stop them. And when the war ended, the men who had once been dismissed as too small, too slow, too old-fashioned, or too cautious had helped bring down the most dangerous regime Europe had ever seen. British strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was a destroyer cutting through black water. Sometimes it was a pilot climbing into a burning sky. Sometimes it was a gun crew firing in the desert until the barrel glowed. Sometimes it was an infantryman in Normandy walking into the next field because the order had come, and the men beside him were moving. Sometimes it was a prisoner standing straight in front of an interrogator. Sometimes it was a young man from a town a village, a factory, a farm, a mine, a shipyard, or a street of terraced houses, carrying the burden of an empire, an island, and a future he might never live to see. That is what Germans really learned about British soldiers. They could be defeated in a battle, they could be criticized, they could be underestimated, but they were terribly difficult to break. And in the end, that mattered more than all the early German confidence in the world. If you watched until the end, write the word Dunkirk in the comments. And remember this: the British soldier of the Second World War did not need to be perfect to be worthy of honor. He only had to keep going when stopping would have been easier. That was enough to change history.